This occurred nearly 20 years ago when I was a Boy Scout. I'll go into as much detail as I remember since this happened so long ago. I'd been a scout for most of my teen years, and I enjoyed the outdoors, nature, and whatnot. Every summer, our troop would take our annual camping trip up to the mountains of North Carolina. It's a beautiful site with many hiking trails, campgrounds, and various places to go fishing. The camp we'd be staying at was a less popular campground called Camp Oak Hill, which is located in front of the forest, right by a large lake. It had a dining hall, some great hiking trails, cabins, and restrooms. My friend Matt, who I'm still friends with to this day, was the person I'd always hang out with, so I would, of course, be bunking with him. Our troop drove the 3-hour-long drive to the campground, and we immediately unpacked our gear and moved everything to our cabins. By the time we got situated, it was practically dark out, and our scoutmaster told us to get ready for bed for our big day tomorrow. Fast forward to around midnight, Matt and I were in our cabin, bored as hell, playing some games on our phones, when he recommended we sneak out and go explore the woods. I agreed, and we headed out, trying to avoid being seen by our scout leaders. I had brought my camera with me, as YouTube was only a few years old at the time, so I decided to bring it to film whatever we found. Matt first went into the tree line, with me behind him, recording as much as I could. We walked about a good mile or so into the woods and eventually came across a little clearing when Matt suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. I asked him what was wrong, but he told me to be quiet, and then asked, "Dude, did you hear that?" "Hear what?" I asked. It took me a few seconds, but then I heard it. There was a faint crying sound coming from the trees next to us, but it was too dark to see just what was making the noise. The more we walked towards it, the louder it got. From my perspective, it sounded like a girl crying in distress. Being the friendly and helpful guy I was, I called out to whoever was there, but the crying continued. And that's when it hit me. The crying was on a loop. It was the same whimpering and wailing repeated over and over again, and I felt sick to my stomach. I told Matt we had to go, and we turned around and headed back the way we came as quickly as we could. We got back to our cabin safely, but didn't get a minute of sleep that night. To this day, I'm convinced that whoever was crying in those woods was most likely someone trying to lure unsuspecting people into their sick trap. I have no idea if it was some cult or a group of twisted individuals, but whatever it was, it definitely wasn't good. I'll always remember the time I went to this sleepaway camp in New Jersey. When I was young, I was very shy. Meeting all the other campers at the orientation on the first day was a pretty scary experience for me. I'd much rather been home playing video games or something. I noticed the other kids making friends pretty quickly and I thought I wasn't going to make any. But luckily, this really outgoing kid started talking to me. Paul was a short, red-headed dude who always wore a Boston Red Sox cap. I thought he was the coolest kid back then, but looking back now, I realize he's probably one of those kids who turned into a punk troublemaker in high school. During the tour of the campgrounds on the first day, Paul and I picked up on a lone cabin that looked like it had been abandoned and in disrepair. We asked one of the counselors what happened, and he said he had no idea since it was his first week working there. All he knew was that it hadn't been used for years, and it was off limits to both the counselors and the campers. On the last night of camp, we were in our bunks. Everyone was getting ready to go to sleep. Paul came up to me and whispered something in my ear. He wanted to sneak over to that abandoned cabin just for the fun of it and see what was inside. I wanted to seem cool to Paul since I, for whatever reason, looked up to him, so I agreed. We went outside and kept close to the cabin until everyone was asleep. We waited until the lights in the counselors' cabins were out, which wasn't long since it was already late. Then we ran down the walkway leading through the counselor's cabin toward the abandoned building. My heart was racing the whole time. I wasn't built to be doing mischievous things like this, not at that age at least. Paul led the way until we were by the door of the abandoned cabin. The front door was boarded up, which is one of the reasons why it caught our attention initially anyway. So, we had to go through one of the windows, which, wouldn't you know it, there was one that was completely busted open already. We climbed into the abandoned cabin. Now, these buildings were pretty big. They weren't little shacks like you might be picturing. Each bunk had room for at least 10 campers. This one was no exception. Paul and I stood in the dark room. It was kind of cold in there. We had our arms out in front of us to make sure we didn't walk into anything. I walked into a bunk bed numerous times and heard Paul doing the same. I stopped to listen to what Paul was doing and heard bouncing on one of the beds. I told him to stop messing around. I assumed he was hopping up and down on one of the old bunk beds, but Paul's voice came from the opposite side of the room. As I remember, he said, "That's not me. I thought that was you." We had nothing to use as a light source, so we were in a pitch-black room in a building that hadn't been used for years, and all we heard was someone bouncing up and down on a squeaky mattress. We freaked out and ran for the window we had used to climb inside. It was tiny though, so it took a while to get out. The bouncing sound stopped while I was waiting for Paul to climb out. Suddenly I heard a loud thump sound. I assume whoever was bouncing on that bed must have jumped off. I leaped up to the window, and as I crawled through, I felt 2 hands grab onto my foot and try to pull me back in. I squirmed and kicked, and before I knew it, I was out the window. We ran back to our cabin and locked the door. We debated telling the head counselor but thought it could probably get us in trouble. We never learned who was in there. But we survived the night, and we went home the next day with a pretty creepy story to tell. This happened back in 2006 at a summer camp in rural Georgia. I was 13 years old and had attended camp every year since I was 10. It was my first year at this camp and I loved it. I made a lot of great friends and it felt good to be out in nature for a while. The camp lasted 5 weeks, and the first 2 weeks went just as you imagine, filled with activities that young kids would enjoy. After dinner one night, our head counselors told us about an optional early morning activity called the Polar Bear Ice Challenge. It was this annual ritual where a counselor would throw a watermelon into a lake, and the first person to find and grab it won a prize. The only hazard was the extremely cold water, even in the summer. Despite this, we were stoked to be doing it. The following day, at around 6 a.m., the campers who volunteered got up, and 2 counselors led us to the lake. They lined us up on the dock and explained the rules. No teaming up, no horseplay, no fighting, etc. With that, the counselor threw the watermelon into the lake and blew the whistle. We all dove in and were met with the extreme cold, nearly causing us to get out. I tried diving back in to feel for the melon when something grabbed my foot and started pulling. Thinking it was another camper, I kicked, trying to make him let go. Then I realized whatever was pulling me didn't feel like a hand. It felt so weird, but in the murky water, I couldn't see what it was. After what seemed like forever, I managed to surface, where I saw all the kids on the dock shouting at me. One of the counselors immediately realized what was happening, dove in, and managed to make whatever had gotten a hold of me to let go. He pulled me to shore, and everyone circled around asking questions. All I could tell them was that something had grabbed me. The counselors looked at my ankle, which was bright red with small puncture marks around it. They wanted the health assistant to take a look at it, so we headed back to camp, where my parents and a nurse were called. The camp staff dismissed the redness as a rash, but none of us bought it. My parents took me home after that, and I never went back to that camp. I hadn't found out what had grabbed my ankle that morning, and for the longest time, I wasn't sure I wanted to know. But I brought it up over dinner with my family a few years later. My parents looked at me wide-eyed and told me something they didn't want to share with me at the time. As it turns out, this crazy redneck living nearby would go into the lake to mess with people. He thought the campers had been trespassing on his land and wanted to get back at them. Among other disturbing things, he would fashion a noose using barbed wire to grab hold of the swimmers, which is why my ankle was red. The campground closed down because of it and couldn't reopen until the investigation was completed. Ultimately, they found several unsprung animal traps laying on the bottom of the lake close to shore. They couldn't trace it back to that crazy neighbor, but everyone had their suspicions. My mom said I should be grateful we weren't in the water for too long, as it could have been much worse. Looking back, I'm glad they hadn't told me about all the booby traps the dude had set up. To this day, That incident was the scariest thing that ever happened to me in my life. About 10 years ago, I went to a summer camp near Yosemite National Park, which my parents had signed me up for. Fortunately, it was with my best friend Tom, so I wouldn't be going there without knowing anyone. The camp was for 2 weeks, and was the typical setting you'd expect to find in those old horror movies about teenagers at a summer camp. There were 2 big cabins where the girls and boys slept, along with a big lodge-type building with an activity center and dining hall. Additionally, there were various smaller buildings scattered throughout the camp. Tom and I stayed up later than all the other kids because we got caught up playing a game on our Nintendos. It was starting to get really late, nearly 2 a.m., and we were still playing when the door to the cabin creaked open. Panicking, we both threw our games under the pillows and pretended to be asleep. Footsteps moved around the room from Tom's bed over to mine. Then the footsteps stopped right next to me, and for a short moment, I felt the ever-so-soft feeling of someone breathing down my neck. Thankfully, the footsteps moved away and back to the door. Just before the door closed, I looked over to Tom and whispered how scary that was, especially since whoever that was had been standing right on top of me. We went back to playing on our Nintendos, and that's when I got a text message on my phone that read, "Why are you two still up?" Those of us who had cell phones were given a list of phone numbers of the camp counselors who we should call if something were to happen. But that number didn't belong to any of the counselors, at least not the ones I knew of. I texted back asking, "Who is this?" They never responded. I told Tom, who didn't have a cell phone, and he was just as freaked out as I was. Obviously, it had to be a counselor, or so we thought. We went back to playing on our Nintendos with the screen brightness turned all the way down. But it wasn't long before we heard the back door to the cabin open. We looked at each other, and once again threw our games under the pillows. There were no more footsteps, though. Suddenly, my phone vibrated. It was another text message from the same number. It said, "It's Counselor Sarah. Come outside to the back of the cabin. I have something to show you." I told Tom, and he said it sounded way too suspicious. Then we both wondered if whoever this Sarah person was also the one who just opened the back door. Curious, I got out of bed and took a few steps to the center of the room, where I could get a view down the hall towards the back door. I couldn't really see anything, so I tiptoed down the hall a little bit for a better look. In a recessed section of the hallway, I saw a figure crouching. As I edged closer, I quickly realized it was not a camp counselor, but some really old, creepy-looking man with wild, unkempt hair. I ran back to my bed screaming for help and, of course, waking everybody up. It was at that moment that I heard the back door slam shut. A camp counselor came rushing inside through the front door, and I told everybody what just happened. The counselors went around the whole campsite, searching the perimeter for anyone matching the description I gave. They came up empty. But it was a big place surrounded by trees. It would be nearly impossible to find someone out there in the dark. I went back to bed but couldn't sleep the rest of the night. My parents were called and they picked Tom and I up the next day. That night, while I laid awake in bed, still trying to process what happened, I got another text. It was him. "Sorry you had to leave so early. Hopefully, I'll see you next summer." I threw the phone down in sheer panic. Thankfully, that was the last time I ever heard from him. To this day, I still can't figure out how that man got my phone number. My only guess is that he somehow found a list of numbers that the counselors had made. But this still doesn't explain how he knew who I was. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe.